In the first episode, I explained that Dogma's story and mythos is one great big symbol for the struggle against nihilism. I explained what symbolism is, order and chaos, and why the dragon represents the nihilism that is to be struggled against, as well as the nature of nihilism itself. In this episode, we turn our attention to the actual struggle itself, the responses to nihilism, and how they are depicted in Dragon's Dogma. But to explain that, we need to talk about another huge theme that pervades the game: will. Before we begin, I'll also remind you what I said about how the heart was seen as the seat of the will, or in other words, the seat of values and valuation, in the context of the dragon stealing it. The symbol of values falling into the symbol of chaos is a symbol of the fall into nihilism. Now, if we recognize that the will is the seat of all valuation, then it naturally follows that the will is the part of us that suffers the crisis of nihilism. We've also mentioned that nihilism is when you can't justify any values, not necessarily when you have no values, but that without justification, those values are doomed to crumble and fall away in large part regardless. Thus, when your spirit, your will, falls into nihilism, your will ceases to valuate or to have values as much as it did before. The thing is, though, when the will, defined by the ability to valuate, ceases to do so, it is as if the will is not there at all. And so, in other words, as nihilism progresses, it is as if one loses one's will itself. This also means that, by contrast, if one can justify values, and one is no longer suffering a crisis of nihilism, then one's will shall not vanish, but instead become stronger. Once one has justification for values, then values shall begin to be created once again. As anyone will have noticed if they've played the game, Dragon's Dogma insists constantly on the Arisen's strength of will. In other words, on someone who continues to valuate, strongly, who continues to make values, namely, because they can justify them so thoroughly. And this is the very same person who is facing the dragon of nihilism. Like so much of the game, this follows Nietzsche, in whose philosophy will is also a prominent theme according to this same logic, but in the specific form of the so-called will to power. For all this talk of strength of will, Nietzsche was actually awakened to philosophy by Arthur Schopenhauer, someone who spoke more often of the opposite. Schopenhauer characterized life by suffering. What's more, he believed that suffering comes from all forms of will or desire, and that the only way to be free of suffering was therefore to be free of desire, the final desire to be extinguished being the very will to live. But Nietzsche ultimately rejected this, calling it anti-life, and suggested the opposite. The goal of life is to strengthen the will. Indeed, Nietzsche is said to have valued valuation itself above any particular values. I think there is wisdom in this, in light of what I said just now about will. If one is to overcome nihilism, then to extinguish the will is the exact opposite of that. Because nihilism is the cessation of will, then strengthening of it simply must be part of the way to overcome it. Indeed, Nietzsche even called Schopenhauer's way the will to nothingness, recognizing the same thing. In its place, he proposed the idea of the will to power, or the Wille zur Macht. On its face, the will to power may sound sort of Machiavellian, like a seeking after control over things, or worse, over other people. But this is not true. Let this quote from Nietzsche prove it. "I have found strength where one does not look for it, in simple, mild, and pleasant people, without the least desire to rule. And conversely, the desire to rule has often appeared to me a sign of inward weakness. They fear their own slave soul and shroud it in a royal cloak. The powerful natures dominate. It is a necessity. They need not lift one finger. In fact, wishing to live with such power would be the opposite of the will to power. The will to power is really the will to overcoming resistance. Think about it. Do you really get to experience power if you are not overcoming anything? And all challenges, if you could even call them that, fall instantly with no effort required? What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that a resistance is overcome. Knowing this, you can easily see how this is realized in Dragon's Dogma. The Arisen's will is constantly emphasized as they go on a quest to overcome the greatest challenge imaginable, defeating the humongous dragon of nihilism, Grigori. But that's not to forget the other monsters, and perhaps unfriendly humans, along the way. But Nietzsche believed that the will to power was not just something to cultivate. He believed it permeated all of reality, even inanimate objects and forces, just especially the psyches of all humans and animals. Even identifying other kinds of will, like Schopenhauer's will to nothingness, and the will to truth he identified in Christianity. He believed they were just a veiled manifestation of the will to power in the end. But if he believed everything is the will to power anyway, how could he say the other types of will are any problem at all? Well, I have a guess based on what he has said and based on some of my own views. The difference is that these kinds of wills are self-undermining. In the will to nothingness, we find a will that seeks to end will itself. In the will to truth spawned of Christianity, we see people seeking to detach themselves from will, to get some ideal of an objective viewpoint. He saw the very same issue in Christianity placing the ideal place as heaven, some other world to be reached after death, and how it valorizes passivity and meekness, a will that undermines will, seeking an end to striving, to challenge, to resistance to be overcome. In essence, he viewed such wills as being wills that ultimately serve nihilism, seeking to destroy the will rather than strengthen it. And as we remember from the discussion of Schopenhauer, to end will requires death. Seeking to overcome nihilism, as well as for other reasons, Nietzsche could not have any of this, and branded such ideas anti-life, or else an example of saying no to life. Before we continue discussing the will to power, I want to propose another kind of symbolism in Dragon's Dogma. I propose that the various major figures throughout the story and world are symbolic of responses to nihilism. They are examples of what kinds of orientations we can have when it comes to overcoming the challenge of nihilism itself, represented therefore by people's reactions to the dragon of nihilism. Because we just discussed this concept of being anti-life, let's begin with the anti-life examples. The first example is the most common one, quite simply, the common person, and which Nietzsche would claim is the common person of the real world as well. He called this kind of person a passive nihilist, or the last man, which he considered the opposite of his ideal, the Übermensch. Everything around them decays and produces decay, that nothing will endure until the day after tomorrow except one species of man, the incurably mediocre. The mediocre alone have a prospect of continuing and propagating themselves. They will be the men of the future, the sole survivors. The last man is a person that loses the ability to strive or to will and consigns themselves purely to a quiet comfort, following the routines set out for them by society and the happenstance of their lives so far, never even questioning why he lives the way he lives, let alone knowing. When it comes to nihilism, the last man, the common person, merely turns away or flees the issue, wishing to continue their comfortable life free from the discomforting thoughts. Similarly, the common people of Granzes flee the dragon and simply attempt to get on with their routines as normal. I propose this to have a subtype, which I'll call the Traditionalist, and which you can see in people like the Faith, those who try to cling to old ways, believing that we can simply go backwards and recover the meaning we had before, despite the harsh reality in our faces. People grappling with nihilism in the real world frequently take this option, choosing to turn to traditional religion as a way to, in my opinion, simply tape over the cracks, all the while not contending with the fact that their nihilism exists exactly because these traditional religions failed to provide a coherent system of meaning in life that could have prevented such a crisis. The Traditionalist also suffers all the same problems as traditional religion, including those discussed earlier about Christianity, hoping for some other world where everything will be better and bringing nothing but meekness and passivity in the meantime. There is another group in Dragon's Dogma that wishes for another place, though, and they represent the next kind of nihilist, represented by the death cult Salvation, led by the character Elysian in the game. To get an idea of what they're like, if you've forgotten or not played the game, take a look at this character description for Elysian that used to be on the official Dragon's Dogma website. It took the dragon only seconds to wipe entire nations from the map of the world. One of the nations which the dragon had utterly destroyed had been large and powerful, enough so that if not for the dragon's attacks, it may well have come out the victor of the endless strife. But it was not a tragedy without survivors, and among those few who lived through the horrors of that attack was the son of the king, the prince of this lost country. One of his eyes, wounded in his flight from the dragon's attack, began to fester, and before long the pestilence would claim his life. He took his rage and regret and transmitted them to the page via ink and quill. As the racking fever and pain gripped his body, he came to one conclusion. Humans deserved to be destroyed. The world and its people clearly needed to be purged by the dragon's claws in order to be reborn anew. He titled his writings The Testament of Hopeless Regret. The existence of this text eventually led to the creation of a continent-wide secret society named Salvation. The testament came to be blazoned always with the mark of a single eye, the remaining eye. This is most likely why Salvation favours the use of the Cyclops, which they call the beasts that beckon the destruction. Then, many years later, one young man performed an unheard act. Before a large gathering of his Salvation brethren, he tore out his own right eye. Where he came from, or what brought him to the doors of Salvation, is unknown. What is known is that he believed that in giving up his eye, he remade himself in the image of Salvation's creator, and impressed upon his brethren that this was the man who could lead their cause to success. Just as he had desired, the young man quickly rose through the ranks and eventually became their great leader, the one who guided them, and was given the name Elysian to refer to the paradise that they expect to follow death. This kind of nihilist I call the Madman. The Madman is driven, mad by nihilism, or more accurately, the terrible matter of witnessing the extreme suffering of this world with nothing to justify it or any reason to go on despite it. Thus, the madman is like Schopenhauer, believing that the suffering of this world justifies its destruction, and so ends up with a craving for suicide or for thoughtless destruction. As it turns out, salvation manages both of these, wishing both for their own deaths and the destruction of the entire world. Regardless of whether the madman chooses one or both, they are defined not by an attempt to overcome nihilism, but as fully succumbing to it, even to the point of no longer seeing any reason to value coherent thought and declaring the world has no right to exist. Ultimately, their fate is the fate of Elysian. The dragon of nihilism brings them destruction. Now, we move on to the Arisen. Arisens are symbolically defined by their facing up to nihilism, the dragon of nihilism, in some way, and as such being pro-life in some way, although not necessarily entirely. The name in Japanese also tells us something. In Japanese, the Arisen is called Kakusha, which means awakened one. Typically, this refers to the awakening of Buddhism, but in this case, can only be awakening to the crisis of nihilism. In other words, an Arisen symbolizes someone who acknowledges and tries to overcome nihilism. But if you have played the game, you may know that the fate of the Arisen is not always to defeat the dragon and become the seneschal. Off in the hill-figure knoll lives the Dragonforged, an ancient 1,000-year-old Arisen. This may be a tenuous connection, but I believe he may stand loosely for something like what Oswald Spengler called the Indian Nihilist. The Dragonforged became an Arisen 100 years before the events of the game. He eschewed all attachments, not wanting to be distracted from his quest to kill the dragon, and ended up fighting the dragon alone. Eschewing all attachments, the dragon could not even offer him the bargain by which he'd become the Duke. But in the ensuing battle, the Dragonforged's weapon broke, and he was forced to fight with his bare hands, which resulted in his arms being blackened, as one can see them in the present, but also in him simply having to retreat from the dragon. Ultimately, he chose to retreat from all of society. This mimics somewhat the behaviour of those who practice Indian asceticism, where practitioners eschew all attachments and pleasure in order to seek enlightenment in solitude. Essentially, I think the Indian ascetics and the Dragonforged both faced up to the dragon of nihilism and failed. They thus chose to withdraw from the struggle against nihilism, and then from all other kinds of struggle. However, this represents merely a more peaceful form of Schopenhauer's will to nothingness, as the goal of Indian spirituality is typically to end suffering and escape striving, and so the Dragonforged cannot be said to successfully overcome nihilism. Then there is the Duke, who offers the opposite kind of withdrawal from resistance, but withdrawal all the same. Instead of withdrawing to an internal pursuit of enlightenment, the Duke took the dragon's bargain, in order to become the Duke in the first place, and withdraws instead into his palace. The type of nihilist he represents is what I call the Hedonist. The Hedonist becomes aware of the problem of nihilism, but deems it unbeatable, often without much effort. Then, instead of eschewing attachments, they sacrifice all higher values, including those that could truly resolve their crisis of nihilism, and instead seek to avoid the suffering that inevitably follows by indulging in as much comfort and pleasure as possible, whether that's drugs, food, alcohol, sex, or indeed power over others. The dragon's bargain itself is crucial to this symbol as well, as in order to gain the wealth and power, the Duke had to give up a higher value, his true love, Lenore. But just like the Hedonist can never truly escape their nihilism, and never truly atone for their total abandonment of higher values for base pleasures, nor can the Duke ever atone for his abandonment of his true love, as we see in one cutscene where the Duke goes so mad with guilt that he tries to kill Eilonor in a frenzy.
My lord, what are you... Lenore! Oh, my love! Forgive me!
My Lord Edmund, is something...
Lenore, forgive me! I was wrong! I take it back, Lenore! I'm sorry! I'm sorry! Lenore!
There is one more arisen who struggles with nihilism, but does not overcome it. They find themselves unable to win, but nevertheless refuse to simply give in. This is called the active nihilist by Nietzsche, and he identified as one himself. Instead of overcoming nihilism, and instead of the resignation of the passive nihilist, the active nihilist seeks to bring about a worsening of the crisis of nihilism, not for the purposes of destroying the world, nor for the purposes of ensuring others succumb to it, but rather to hasten people's consciousness of it, and with that, to hasten the rise of one who can finally overcome it. They do take agency in the struggle against nihilism, but don't ultimately claim or even seek victory for themselves. For this reason, this response is the first of the two truly pro-life responses to the crisis of nihilism. But who am I talking about? He has already been mentioned. His name is Grigori. But, I hear you say, is not the dragon a representative of nihilism? Well, yes. But the people that become him are a representative of active nihilists. Active nihilists become agents of chaos, of nihilism itself, but only in the hopes of ending it. In the case of real active nihilists, this means attacking the current failing system of meaning so that it collapses faster and drawing people's attention to its flaws. Also, while I say it is Grigori, I really mean all dragonkin. Those who fall in battle in their struggle to the dragon become lesser dragons, drakes, worms, and wyverns. Those who fall to the seneschal in their final struggle become true dragons. All of them seek to hasten the destruction of the world by becoming active participants in it, and we can even see Grigori's a nihilist himself in the cutscene following his defeat.
Stubborn child. Whatever meaning life holds, it makes men deaf to all reason.
However, if you listen to their dialogue in the game, you constantly hear them shouting encouragement to the Arisen, goading them forward, telling them to fight and win. We can also see it in how Grigori ceases his destruction the moment that he finds a new Arisen that might defeat him, and his disdain for the truly destructive desires of the Salvation cult.
The rantings of an up-jump zealot make for tedious listening. His ilk serves no role in what is to come.
The only one that now remains is the true Arisen, the true Übermensch, the one who finishes the cycle of eternal return, and the one who truly overcomes nihilism.